Okay, topic for today is the Mexican Revolution. Lesson number one regarding the Mexican Revolution is that the Mexican Revolution is not Mexico's war for independence. In US history, the American Revolution is the US war for independence. That's not the case for Mexico. Mexico's war for independence was 100 years prior to this, in the 1810s. So in the 1910s, they have their revolution, a war that lasts for 10 years. And these are some of the main individuals that I'll be bringing up and talking about. So yeah, let's start with Porfirio Diaz. The time in which, so Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico from the 1870s all the way until 1910. That period is referred to as the Porfiriato. He is, one of the things he's recognized for is having modernized the Mexican economy. He was very friendly to foreign investors, especially investment from the United States. He's also remembered for bringing in lots of railroads, but these railroads were built on former ejidos. Ejidos were indigenous communal land that indigenous people had access to for hundreds of years. And a lot of these railroads were built at the expense of these ejidos and the people who lost access to those ejidos who were already the poorest in society. Not to mention that these railroads were often built not with integrating the Mexican economy in mind, but rather for the purposes of foreign investors to be able to extract whatever they were trying to extract. And so they would be built, from the sugar mills, or from the mines to the ports, or from the mines to the US-Mexico border. So they were built for the purpose of benefiting the foreign investors, not in integrating or strengthening the Mexican economy. So, and even though Mexico was independent, it was very much economically controlled by the United States. The United States owned 100% of Mexican oil. 76% of Mexican corporations. 96% of the land that was used for agriculture. 80% of exports, 66% of imports. So the US was very happy with Diaz. The US supported him. And, he was essentially a dictator who would just get reelected over and over and over. Hence, one of the biggest results of the Mexican Revolution was since then, Mexico has not allowed for re-elections. And so it's a direct lesson learned from not wanting to have another Porfirio Diaz. The Mexican Liberal Party, Partido Liberal Mexicano, one of its best known leaders were the Magon brothers. Magon. They were people who would speak up against Porfirio Diaz. And for that, they would be arrested, they would be exiled, and then the US would help Mexico and arrest them in the United States and incarcerate them. I think Magon ended up dying in a US prison as a favor to Mexico, to Diaz in particular. In 1908, there was an interview with a US journalist by the last name of Creelman, and so hence it's referred to as the Creelman interview. And in 1908, Creelman asked Porfirio Diaz if he was planning to run for re-election in 1910. And Diaz said no. And so this provided a lot of hope to people in Mexico that there would be change after so many decades of having Porfirio Diaz. So Madero, Francisco Madero, decided to run for the presidency against Porfirio Diaz. But right before the election, Porfirio Diaz found an excuse to arrest Madero and then said, well, since you're arrested, you're not eligible to run for president. So even though I wasn't planning to run for re-election, I guess I'm going to have to be president again. Madero managed to escape from jail. He created a plan, the plan of San Luis Potosí, where he said, no re-election. And let's return the ejidos to the people they were taken from. And that's because it wasn't just the railroads that they weren't just taken for the purpose of railroads, they were also taken by the big landowners, the big hacienda owners. And so Madero was running on this idea of, basically no more dictators and returning land to the people. He ended up launching the revolution itself from the United States, specifically from Texas. These are the two most famous generals of the Mexican Revolution. One is Emiliano Zapata in the south. The other one is Pancho Villa in the north. Emiliano Zapata had his own plan called the Plan de Ayala. He was from the Mexican state of Morelos and just kind of southeast of Mexico City. And his promises were land and liberty, tierra y libertad. And so you can see here how access to land is an important thing for people. Now, Zapata, he never had plans for the whole country. He was always focused on the people of his home state of Morelos, with a focus on people of Native American descent, of which he was one. Then there's Pancho Villa. A little bit of backstory on Pancho Villa. It turns out Francisco Villa wasn't his actual name. His birth name was Doroteo Arango. He lived in the north, I think in the state of Chihuahua. And before he became a Mexican general in the revolution, he had actually become a bandit living on the wrong side of the law. And I think the story there is that his sister was sexually attacked by a wealthy person in that region. And so he went and killed that person. And so then after that, he was a fugitive of the law and known as a bandit. But once the revolution starts, he lends his support to Madero. And so, yeah, it helps Madero with fighting the revolution, and then eventually breaks with Madero, and I'll get to that in a bit. Why Francisco Pancho Villa? So Francisco Villa was not his legal name. It was the name he used after he was hiding from his origins of what he had done. So Pancho is a nickname, is one of the nicknames that are used for people named Francisco. And so that's why he's best remembered as Pancho Villa. So initially, he helps Madero get rid of Diaz and succeeds. But once Zapata and Villa helped Madero take over, then they said, okay, fulfill your promises. And Madero was saying, no, you put down your arms and then I fulfill the promises. And they're like, no, you fulfill your promises and then we'll put down our arms. And so even though they initially helped Madero, they then turned on Madero because he wasn't implementing the things he promised. And Villa has a lot of success in early years, like 1913 and 1914. But then in 1915, he loses a lot of battles. And I'll get to why in a second. Well, not a second, a couple minutes. I don't want to forget to at least mention the soldaderas, the female soldiers of the Mexican Revolution. So both sides, the federal troops and the revolutionaries, had women who were camp followers. You know, these could be the wives, the sisters, the mothers of the soldiers, and you know they could provide you know, food and kind of help with nursing and so forth, the wounded. But beyond that, in the especially on the revolutionary side, there were women who took up arms and fought as soldiers, not just as camp followers. Some of these women who fought as soldiers were, you know, kind of rank and file soldiers. But some of them made it to the point of being leaders and generals. Some of them did so as women, but others did so dressed as men and would hide their sex from others. And so there's some very interesting stories there about kind of gender roles in Mexico during the revolution, and how some women felt they could get further by disguising their womanhood and you know, passing as men. And so yeah, there's some really interesting stories there. All right. A lot of what I'll be pointing out is how the US played a role in this Mexican Revolution. And in 1913, the United States decided to support Huerta and helped a coup happen against Madero. That was in 1913. But then in 1914, the United States occupies the port of Veracruz and decides to support Carranza instead. And so the US, you know, is playing a role throughout this. The US plays a role in why the revolution happens in the first place, and who ends up in power each step of the way. When the US supported Carranza, there was this whole, I don't know, incident where, first of all, it's the Port of Veracruz. The Port of Veracruz, you might recall, is important historically. It's where the US lands during the Mexican-American War, with the largest amphibious landing in history up to that point. It's where Cortez landed on his way to Tenochtitlan. It's an important location to make your way to Mexico City. And then when they're supporting Carranza, they provide supplies that make a big difference. They help Carranza essentially win the whole war. Carranza and Obregón win the whole war. And then there's this incident that happened. So there's US sailors who come ashore to buy oil for the USS Dolphin. but the sailors landed in restricted area. They were arrested for an hour and a half. And then they apologized to them and let them go. But the US demanded the raising of the US flag and a 21-gun salute as an apology. And the Mexican president said, no, we're not going to do all that. And so then that was the excuse the US took to occupy the port of Veracruz. And so on the surface, this was because of the indignation of not having gotten their 21-gun salute as an apology. But in reality, it was to support Carranza. The US supported Carranza with weapons, with radios, with artillery, with machine guns, and so all of these supplies ended up making a big difference. And that is why, well, Pancho Villa lost so many battles and essentially lost his whole army in 1915. Right before that, while things were still going well, Villa and Zapata met in Mexico City. There's the Mexican state of Morelos, where Zapata was from, just south of Mexico City. So Villa was very upset with the United States for helping Carranza defeat his army, giving him the supplies to defeat his army. So in 1916, Villa killed 17 US citizens in Mexico. And then he crossed the US-Mexico border into Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 18 Americans there. And this is the title and author of a book on this topic. So the United States in 1916, being led by General John J. Blackjack Pershing, led an expedition, a punitive expedition, meaning it was an expedition to punish Villa for having crossed into the United States. And so, yeah, the United States sent in the army into Mexico. The United States tested out new weapons of war, tested out machine guns, airplanes, just new weapons, because World War I had already started, but the US didn't enter until 1917. And so this was an opportunity for the United States to basically get a little practice on with their new weapons of war. Now, the US Army was not able to find and kill Villa, and that helped make Villa a national hero. And so they made corridos about him. $6,000 Americans, 200 airplanes, looking for Villa all over the country. The airplane started flying. So looking for Villa. So yeah, there's they weren't able to find him, they weren't able to kill him. And so this made Villa a hero in Mexico, and this also put pressure on Carranza, who had been supported by the United States, but the Mexican people put a lot of pressure on Carranza to make the US leave. So Carranza, even though the US helped put him in place in the presidency, Carranza asked the US to leave. The US did not leave, and so Carranza got into a battle with the United States to make them leave. And then they did after that battle. And so Carranza turned on the US, even though the US had helped them. They came up with a new constitution, the Constitution of 1917. And like I mentioned, actually, I don't have it here, but I need to add that, where the no re-election was very important outcome and difference that came out of the revolution. So in the US, presidents are presidents for 4 years and can be reelected one time for an additional 4 years. In Mexico, presidents are presidents for 6 years, but there's no reelection. They cannot be reelected. And honestly, you don't have to know these specific articles. But, you know, they established free education, education free of religious beliefs, education that is free, freedom of the press, no private courts. More importantly, 10% of the Mexican population died, and another 10% left after the Mexican Revolution to the United States. It is in the 1910s, well, no, in the 1920s, following the devastation of the revolution in the 1910s. It is in the 1920s when we see the largest wave of Mexican immigration from Mexico to the United States. The largest in terms of percentage of the people of Mexico leaving, and the percentage of immigrants made up by Mexican people out of immigrants in the US. And then there's a peaceful transition of power in 1920 from Carranza to Obregón, and so hence that is seen as the official end of the revolution. Even though, you know, around 1915, 1916, you know, most of the fighting is already dwindling down. Comments, questions, anything to repeat, explain, or slides to go back to?